Hello. Well, let's jump into it. Jeff,
Yes.
as Panasonic faces and continues to meet growing demand for batteries, how are you encouraging both innovation and advances in sustainability?
So I think for Panasonic, we're one of the largest battery makers, EV battery makers in the world. We have the largest battery maker in the United States. And we're very excited about the various technologies that are coming out in the battery space. I'm not really going to go into that too much right now, but I see in each generation incremental change and driven by innovation in terms of capacity, what's in the battery. What I think our sort of special sauce, as it were, is bringing that to scale.
Yeah.
We are currently making 2 billion cells a year in Nevada for a single customer, and we're going to be replicating that in Kansas as well. So I think our innovation is really in the manufacturing side and bringing this, the scale that we need to really move the market forward.
Yep. So, and maybe just for all of you, we're talking in this panel about creating better batteries. Better can mean a lot of different things. We obviously are after enhanced performance, more efficient, cost-effective production, reduced environmental impact, satisfaction of evolving regulatory requirements. I'm interested to hear from each of you sort of what recent developments are you most excited about? What have we newly solved that is making the biggest impact for you?
Let me leap in. I think better from the perspective of manufacturing batteries is obviously about efficiency and bringing the cost down in order to enable the greater adoption of what is going to be one of the key drivers of an energy transition. But I spend most of my time in the supply chain, and Aimee will talk about this as well from the upstream perspective. Responsibly produced materials from countries that we might want to do business with more than others, ideally producing batteries more and more sustainably over time, and increasingly making sure that we recycle more of the materials in order to reduce our collective over-reliance, for example, on parts of East Asia, which currently have a near monopoly on the battery supply chain. So better means a number of things, from responsibility to sustainability to geopolitics.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I would completely agree. It's really the connecting of the dots between my colleagues here is that mining used to be so far from the end product and so far from people's minds. We are in a mining country, and yet most Americans don't know the names of mining companies, but they know the brands of the products they buy from. And yet there was such a disconnect, right? The banana leaves the plantation, it still looks like a banana at the store, but our mined materials don't look at all like our phones, building, infrastructure, cars, etc. But this moment now to connect dots, between the work that Doug and Jeff are both doing, and to really bring value back to the mining companies who now can have the value of not just producing a product, but it's the way that they do it and the way they interact with the communities there. That's a tremendous opportunity.
Yep. If I may just give 10 seconds of color to the point that you mentioned that we were doing something together. We're talking about being able to track raw materials from their source, which could be recycled scrap or freshly mined material, all the way through the supply chain at the batch level to the batteries, for example, that are produced by Panasonic, which three years ago wasn't possible economically or at production scale, and certainly is now.
So I fully agree there, and I think maybe just from where I sit in sort of the government affairs part of a large battery maker, sort of one of the things that's very exciting right now is the recognition across governments, stakeholders, groups like SAFE, that this is where the energy and in many cases the money needs to be placed. This is a critical time, and I think things like traceability is partly being driven by some of that government engagement. So I think things like this forum and others are really important right now because of what's going on in that space.
Sure. I don't know about you all, but what I've found is in the last year or so, when I'm talking to sort of lay people who are not in this industry at all, they are newly aware that critical minerals exist and that they are in our batteries and in our phones, et cetera. And so I'm starting to get more questions about that. So Aimee, from your perspective, what are still the challenges that are facing the mining industry in looking at responsible sourcing of critical minerals? What do we need to solve there?
Okay, I mean, it starts from where minerals are. They are in the ground where they are, and we can't just move them to a more convenient location. And many businesses, you can say, look, if that were 5 miles down the road, it would be a lot easier. If it weren't near this community, if it weren't near that national park, then it would be more convenient. They are where they are. And so that calls on this industry to deal with that particular challenge by being involved early. With the community, with the regulators in that community, and with doing quality design early, and really building confidence rather than anxiety amongst people who are where they are operating. And then the other big challenge is that the work that Jeff and Doug are doing to make these connections, I think you just said 3 years. I mean, it's so recent that we haven't yet brought enough value back to mining companies to feel that they're being differentiated, so that if they are operating to best practices, that will be appreciated in the markets. We haven't had laws that required it, and we haven't had markets yet that valued it. And so there are several mining companies in the room here who are doing IRMA audits, Albemarle, SQM, Vale. There are N brands who are making commitments to buy from them, including US companies like GM, Ford, Rivian, Microsoft, others. But the real value coming back, whether that's premiums or preferred contracts, are not yet manifest enough that we've made a compelling case to the mining industry. This is worth it. We should step in. It's more beneficial than risky to be this transparent. We should operate to best practice. Will the market bring it a value greater than a risk? And that testimonial and value case still needs to be proven back to them.
And Doug, I think that takes us back to Circulor. Can you tell us a little bit about how you see traceability in the battery supply chain, supporting sustainability goals, and also sort of the monetization of sustainability?
Yeah. So, I mean, I'm going to answer the question a bit more broadly than sustainability to answer that. Aimee's absolutely right. There is currently no price premium for material that might be dug up in the US to a different set of standards that you might find somewhere else done differently. And that's been a problem for a while, because at the moment, in a sort of bit of an arms race for enough of the nickel or the lithium that you might need, most people have just bought on based on quality and availability and price. Now, one driver of that price premium could be a tax credit. The 45X manufacturing tax credit is an example of that. Regulation, of course, is a big stick, which doesn't necessarily create any kind of price premium. But the other side of this, of course, now, as we all now know, is tariffs. So a penalty for not doing things the right way in the right places. Traceability plays a role because, of course, it proves who touched what when within your supply chain, and that if you've bought something responsibly from one of your members, for example, who is doing a good job, that's actually what you're putting into your batteries, into your cars, and that in time, whether those attributes that people are interested in are responsible sourcing or more sustainably produced batteries, or even where things came from, and that it genuinely does contain a certain level of recycled material, those attributes have value. At a previous SAFE Summit a couple of years ago, there was a lot of discussion about how transparency and standards combined created competitive advantage, or could create competitive advantage. I think that's very true. Yeah. There are certainly consumers in different parts of the world that care, if only they could have reliable information on what it is that they were being sold.
Yeah. Well, Doug, you touched on not just tracing of sourcing, but also recycling. I'm curious, Jeff, what are you seeing at Panasonic in terms of circularity of the battery supply chain, and what does that look like for you and your,
So as a company with a very complicated and supply chain, in order to build 2 billion cells a year, any additional sources through recycling is going to be extremely important. As a company, this concept of circular economy is something we try to do in all of our business lines. We're not just in batteries. That's obviously the biggest part of our business. But We're working right now with a company called Redwood Materials in Nevada. They've been using all the scrap from our processes since 2019, and we're looking for ways to increase the sort of the kind of content that we're providing to them. Our new facility in Kansas, which will be going online later this year, will be using cathode active material from Redwood. So we see that right from Nevada into our process in Kansas. And we see that as an increasingly important part of the overall sort of supply chain, but also then gets into our goals as a sustainable company. That's something we really lead into, and it's an important part of the process.
And is that an area as well where Panasonic is able to use its market share and the volume of its business to bring sort of tested but not yet tested at scale technologies into play?
So I think in terms of the inputs, we do have some of that market scale to bring in. We do our own testing. That becomes really important, but it still takes about 18 months in terms of getting something up to the scale that we need. I think the sort of the traceability side becomes even more important there, and understanding what's going into the material. I think going back to sort of your earlier point on traceability, with a large company like ours, again, back to the complicated supply chain, we often just don't know what we don't know. And we're making these massive investments in securing these materials, and we need to know what sort of the implications are. So we work, platforms like Circulor that we work with are increasingly important, not just for us as a company, but for our customers as well. It's driving that. So I think that also then flows into compliance with growing regulatory requirements as well, right? This is something that's going to be increasingly important.
Yep. And so the three of you represent sort of all different parts of the battery supply chain. Aimee, maybe you could address how you think cross-sector collaboration helps to build a better supply chain, and where more collaboration is maybe needed.
Well, first of all, I'll say that conflict is expensive. So we're talking about, can you bring green premiums to companies who are doing more and doing better and meeting higher standards? But conflict itself is expensive the other direction. Protests and strikes and litigation are a big part of the delay that's been spoken of today in terms of getting permits, the anxiety that communities feel. And so the mining industry is producing materials that we're all using every day. We're all complicit in that. And where we can lean in to create value for mining companies to do better, that's an opportunity moment. And so you see, when I speak to you all, my board of directors is equally between NGOs, affected communities, labor unions, with mining companies, their customers and investors. And they sit at the table in part because they know that they have differences in what they value and why and how they value it, but the tension between them creates something greater there. Mm-hmm. And they can see that there's not going to be any security of supply if we don't have community support, and if we don't also look straight on the fact that it's estimated that half of energy transition minerals, critical minerals we're talking about today, are estimated to come from on or adjacent to Indigenous peoples' lands. And so we need to look straight at these issues of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People and consent. And can this industry, which brings often living wage jobs with benefits, bring a sense of benefit sharing and prosperity to communities who have been highly skeptical? They're looking at 500 years of evidence to the contrary. We have a totally new opportunity moment right now to redefine how this industry approaches those communities and builds a sense that this is an excellent business neighbor to have. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it strikes me that there's a decent portion of our population that has not actually heard of responsible mining as a concept at all. Mm-hmm. Do you find that you have been able, or in the process of being able to shift the conversation from no mining to responsible mining?
Yes. I mean, I think there are some who understandably, people have gotten numbed to the green logos put on everything, right? And they're very skeptical to greenwashing no matter where you are in the political spectrum, and fatigued by it and asking, does anybody care anymore? Which is, a very fair question. But I think you have, as evidence in SAFE today, the sense that these materials are important for a variety of things and that we are using every day in society. And what are we going to do to make sure that the way we produce them, it's not an industry we're talking about moving away from. You've had speaker after speaker saying these are things we're going to need more of, and yet how can we do that in a way that people feel like it's a shared prosperity, it's not a long-term legacy of harm?
Yep.
If I could build on that, I think, starting with IRMA and then with tools like Circulor, you're building trust within the system, right? From the very beginning, straight on through to where companies are comfortable making the investments. And I think all of us are facing a challenge in the demand for some of these materials, right? So the more that we can effectively sort of bring things online, trusted, sort of within a trusted supply chain, I think it's going to benefit everybody. So I think when you talk about cross-sectoral collaboration, we're all sort of in the same boat here.
Yeah.
And I think that sort of cooperation starting from the very beginning.
Well, and you sit in an interesting position because you are sort of in the middle of the supply chain, right? You're neither the mine nor the manufacturer of the electric vehicle.
Right.
So what are you seeing in terms of how well the end-to-end sector is collaborating at this stage?
I think it's still somewhat of a new industry, right? And I think there's a lot of growth going on right now, but I think we're aware of what the issues are, and I think it's now a combination of working with all of the stakeholders, government, companies, it's there, right? We just need to now sort of make sure that we're pushing forward.
Yeah.
There were two conversations on this stage this afternoon. The first in relation to defense materials and the plea for government to consciously help to construct new value chains. And then Kurt Kelty, the penultimate speaker, talking from GM's perspective, its conscious choices about, effectively creating its own supply chain with direct supply agreements across the supply chain. And that conscious design of supply chains, rather than relying purely on procurement to cascade through a supply chain, usually based on price, is a part of it. And then enforcing those conscious choices with the requirement to show that having made a direct supply deal with someone who's doing things properly, that's actually what you're putting into your vehicles.
Right.
Or into your energy storage system. All of that's now possible, and 5 years ago we could have sat here and said it would be lovely and wouldn't have been possible.
Yeah. Well, and we've talked about traceability as a way to ensure sustainability, but what about from a national security perspective? What's the role of traceability there?
It's effectively the same. So in this case, if you don't want to have material coming from somewhere, then you can exclude it at the border if you wish to, purely by enforcing a requirement for traceability. Where did this raw material come from? Who did stuff to it on the way to it arriving here on this container ship? And am I therefore prepared to allow it in? Now, tariffs, you've got to buy American. Well, great. Okay, how American is American? Because clearly the entirety of the global supply chain is not yet replicated here. And therefore, what are you prepared to allow to be made overseas, and what proportion of this car, this whatever, has actually been made here rather than just the sticker being put on the windscreen here. So I'm being slightly flippant, but the point is that when you want to enforce those kind of tariffs to buy American or to buy responsibly or to buy sustainably, it ultimately comes from being able to see into the deeper tiers of the supply chain and ensure that what people are claiming is true.
And to the extent Robbie was talking earlier today about the US seeing itself as a place which differentiates itself because of standards, because you expect when you go to work you're going to be safe at work, right? Because you are producing something that hasn't been produced with forced labor, child labor, that you're not going to contaminate people's drinking water. Now that the US increasingly acts as a finance institution as well. Now you increasingly have government stepping in for finance. It's a way that the tools of traceability, knowing whether it's who you buy from or who you're going to invest in, that you've built expectations that those standards are going to be held wherever in the world you're investing in those relationships. And it's an opportunity not only to change the way that one operation operates, but to bring a safer, more democratic perspective into the region where you're investing in these materials.
Maybe kind of the flip side of that, traceability is sort of the kind of growing requirements of compliance, right? I think this is, having that traceability allows us to ensure that, we are indeed sort of compliance with the tariff requirements, compliance with growing EU or California requirements as well. So I think that just helps us as a company.
Well, I think particularly, in a time like now where there is some uncertainty about what the rules are going to be tomorrow and next week and 6 months from now, and we're talking about, manufacturing cycles that take longer than that, I assume traceability then is key for you in being able to pivot and understand whether you're meeting new standards that you might not have been able to forecast at the time purchasing decisions were made.
And they're changing, right?
Right, yeah.
By the, I think every day in this town is changing. So having that ability to understand, sort of know what we don't know, and then being able to adjust as we need to.
Yep.
Jeff, do you feel like you are seeing value come back to you for using circular economy materials that are retrieved as well as newly extracted materials? Because there's a set of subsidies that create incentives still for new extraction. I'm curious if you see that market value for recycled content as well.
I think when we're faced with the growing demand that we have, any source is going to be part of the solution. So the more sort of circular and recycled material that come in, that's always going to be helpful. I think there's a brand component to it as well. We obviously, as a Panasonic, we like to lean into sort of what we call our green impact. So if we are showing that, I think that helps us in the overall sort of present, creation of a Panasonic brand.
Okay.
In terms of the, actual, how big of a piece of it is right now, I'm not exactly 100% sure, but I think certainly when we talk to the energy business, that circular component we're working on with Redwood is really critical.
Okay.
And tracing of recycling is part of your business as well. Do you see other clients interested in specifically being able to prove out circularity in addition to sustainability generally?
Yeah, no question. So there are, whether you're large commodity trading companies or manufacturers within the value chain itself, you're increasingly being asked for recycled content and to be able to prove two things. One, well, you're going to sell me all this copper, how much of it is really recycled?
Yeah.
And secondly, what was the origin of the scrap? Because that's important too. Particularly if you're talking about battery material, and some of us, we could have a whole afternoon's conversation about, how will the material that we were a few years ago talking about being dug up by artisanal miners in the Congo, how does that find its way onto the global market when you found ways to stop it into the primary supply? And black mass, for example, in the battery supply chain is such a broad blob of mixed materials, it's a pretty easy way for that to find its way into the grey economy. So proof of scrap, I think, is going to be increasingly important. And just because something is recycled doesn't necessarily mean it's good. If you're going to ship scrap from here to, whether it's tire burners in India or other forms of irresponsible recycling elsewhere in the world, and then re-import it and say it's recycled, this is good stuff. So what's happened to it, and where the scrap came from, and how much is recycled is equally important.
Right, so traceability again.
Absolutely right.
Yeah. So as we wrap up, I just would love to hear from each of you, looking at the next 12 months. No, you don't have a crystal ball, but what are you thinking, or at least hoping, is going to be different a year from now in terms of how batteries are built, the supply chain, and what can be better a year from now?
So I would say a year from now, a short time frame, but an increasing number of available sources domestically and friendshoring, right? I think we are faced with, like I've said a couple of times, a real growing need for these materials. As we look at building resilient supply chains, if they're domestic, that's going to help us. So I would hope that in a year from now we've made some progress.
I would love to know that in this moment where there is this spotlight of tremendous opportunity on the mining industry, and people are suddenly more aware and excited that we gave the mining industry a permission slip to be excellent. The IRMA standard is tooled for best practices, and some have said, oh, that's hard, or we don't have time for that right now, but every single chapter, more than 25 chapters in the IRMA standard, has at least one mining company who's already reached over 90% in that, so we know it's very achievable, and there are so many smart people working in this industry, but this comes right back to Doug's work of drawing the links back to bring value to that. And I would love to know that together we brought value to this industry to be excellent.
Thank you. Obviously, the world is an imperfect place, and so is the battery value chain. Light is a great disinfectant, and what we've been talking about here this afternoon is about how we can help shine a light on those actors who are in friendly trading nations or domestic suppliers who are doing things properly, and actually create that business case for them. We've got a long way to go, because actually us in the West for the last 2 decades have allowed things like the battery value chain to evolve entirely elsewhere, and now we're very concerned about it. Light is a great disinfectant. I think that's probably the key theme for me.
Excellent. And do you find, or you said that 12 months is a short time window. That's fair, especially in the mining industry, as we've talked about the permitting timeline there. What do you think, how long do you think it will take before, especially for the mining industry, public sentiment, or at least awareness, is able to evolve enough to make a really meaningful difference in how mines are viewed and how quickly you're able to start on domestic projects? It's a loaded question. Sorry about that.
Well, I mean, existing mines are existing. They have a whole set of challenges, and yet, if we care about the broader environmental and social impacts of them, we will give permission slips for existing mines to be as imperfect as Doug is saying, and to increase our production out of those existing mines that are already operating, where there are already jobs, and that are producing materials right now today. But over the course of a year, we have the opportunity to ensure that our new investments that bring new mines online are really meeting the innovative opportunities for how mining can be for the next few decades ahead.
Yeah.
What would you say?
I agree, absolutely.
Mm-hmm. Well, and I think that matches up with what we talked about in terms of developments in battery manufacture itself, that change is going to be iterative, that we're looking at a slow evolution rather than sort of one massive.
Right, I think as I've seen over the years, it's sort of incremental changes, right? Over the next couple of battery cycles, we'll be designing out certain materials that are a little more difficult to get to, but not really this sort of leap that's going to change things within a short period of time.
Excellent. All right, well, thank you all very much. This has been an excellent conversation.
Great, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.